I would now bring in the patient's perspective. Antonella, it's great to have you with us. So what are your thoughts on future opportunities and implications deriving from both pieces of legislation, the Pharma Package and the EU HTA?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me and for being willing to listen to the patient's voice and the patient's perspective on those two important pieces of legislations, which ultimately will have a huge impact. I mean, the beneficiary the ultimate beneficiaries of those two pieces of legislations are the patients. So I want to stress the fact that these two pieces of legislations are in two different phases of implementation. And this is important to stress for me, because this is it's important to know to what extent we can change things or we can fill gaps in those two legislations. So the HTA regulation, as you all said, will be implemented in January 2025. So the text of the legislation cannot be changed. But we are in the phases of seeing the work done on the implementation acts. So we still have an opportunity to adjust, fix, fill some gaps that are in the current text. And while for the and we have some urgency there. But then on the pharmaceutical strategy, now the text was published by the European Commission, but then there are still many steps to go through before it will be actually become a legislation. Although it is very important to have our voice heard also at this stage. So on the paper, as things are now, both legislations are aimed at speeding up the process of accessibility to innovative treatments for patients. So we, of course, we welcome this intended objective. And also one of our main objective is yes, to accelerate and facilitate access to innovative treatments, but also to make sure that innovation and time to access is equal or as homogeneous as possible across Europe, because we want to avoid to create, patients or European citizens of class A, class B, or C, depending on where they live. So this is why we welcome the European HTA regulation, because the intention is to speed, to accelerate the access to innovative treatments, but also it creates two steps in the process that are homogeneous, that are at European level. So you all mentioned the joint clinical assessment and the joint scientific consultation. So we hope that those two additional steps will facilitate and will reduce the administrative burden on the industry, and so will reduce time to access. Although our concern is that the joint clinical assessment may just be an additional administrative burden. So instead of accelerating, will eventually delay the access to innovative treatments. And so we are really watching now how the implementation acts will address the actual implementation, the work, the process of the joint clinical assessment. And we believe that relevant stakeholders, I mean, the governance should be set up in a way that is as inclusive as possible. So all relevant stakeholders should be part of the process. And on the pharmaceutical strategy, again, we believe that the intentions, I mean, the objectives as they are on the current text are superb. I mean, are excellent for us. But then we really need to look at how the legislation is not only oriented towards the market, but also incentivizing or motivating the interest of the industry to implement research in Europe. So we also want to look at how the pharmaceutical strategy will facilitate the development of clinical trials. For certain cancers, a clinical trial is the last hope, is the only hope. And for instance, for pancreatic cancer, we have a very limited number of clinical trials in Europe compared to other regions, compared to the US, for instance. And for us, this is a problem. This is a gap that needs to be filled. And also on the pharmaceutical strategy, we are very much looking at how the definition of unmet clinical needs and high unmet clinical needs will be fostered throughout the process, because we believe that the definition should be as broad as possible, and should also include beyond the medical aspects, the clinical and medical aspects, should also consider quality of life, and should also consider all the societal aspects that are around the patients. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Antonella, to bring in the patient's perspective here. And I think there's one objective when we're looking at those files which are interconnecting, and this is an objective which is really critical from the patient perspective. You highlighted this one, which is time to access is key at the end of the day. And when we look at the pharma package, there is this measure of launch conditionality, launching products in all 27 countries in a given period of time. This is where industry has to play a significant role to actually be able to do that in a certain period of time. When we look at the second pillar for getting this objective on board, the EU HTA, I think Dirk mentioned very clearly that 30 days after marketing authorization is much earlier than in most of the EU countries when we have an EU HTA report on the table, which should facilitate a speedy access to innovation. And I think that's a very good development, even though challenging to have that procedure kicking in before them or starting before the marketing authorization is existing. But I think it's a very positive signal and sign which we have there in legislation. But I would like to add one third pillar here, which is existing legislation, which is the Transparency Directive. And the European Commission is currently looking into the Transparency Directive. And over the last almost 25 years of its, or 35 years of its existence, we've seen that the timelines which are there are not always upheld at the member state level. So I think from this perspective, to really achieve the objective of time to access is key. We should also look at the application of the Transparency Directive, because there are clear timelines, and it is there's no value in itself of having an EU HTA report as a basis for national decision making. The only thing that counts is really a reimbursement decision at the national level. And I think that the application of the Transparency Directive and that whole discussion should not be forgotten, because that is something we can probably achieve in midterm or even short term when we're getting better in having speedier decisions about access on the basis of the timelines foreseen in the transparency directive. Maybe something we can address later on, but I wanted to bring that into the mix. I think that's a very important pillar, that third pillar as well, which we shouldn't forget in the discussions. Over to you, Dirk. I have a question to you. The Commission's ambitious proposal on the EU HTA and the pharmaceutical package, as we have heard, are clearly interconnected. Both proposals could support the objective of improving access to innovative therapies in the EU while fostering, at the same point in time, innovation. Which aspects of the implementation of these pieces of legislation will be crucial from your perspective to reach before the start of the first joint clinical assessment in 2025 to really achieve the expected outcome? So what needs to be done in the next, 17 or 16 months?
Good question. A lot needs to be done, but of course there's more to that answer than just this short sentence. As we've also shared online on our website, we have this rolling plan, which basically is the implementation table as we see things evolving going forward. What you will see is a lot of implementing acts. So 6 of them, further legislative work together with the Comitology Committee, with the member states, to really get the key components hammered out, to lay down the details, the steps, the actors in all the various parts of the regulation. And that is first and foremost the joint clinical assessment. It's for medicines, but also for devices. The joint scientific consultation. How do we work with the European Medicines Agency? How do we exchange information in full confidentiality? So there's a whole series, 6 of these implementing acts that we're working towards adoption before January 25. And the very first one, I think we can all agree, is the crowning piece. It's the joint clinical assessment for medicinal products. And there, basically next week, 15th of September, we have the very first comitology meeting, which is the member state delegates that will then eventually vote on the text for this implementing act. And the text, the purpose is to basically lay down, quote unquote, the details, that is the precise steps in the joint clinical assessment, the actors, the tasks, the responsibilities. And if you go to the comitology register, what you will already find is the draft rules of procedure for the committee, because it's the very first meeting, as I already said, next week. So there, these need to be adopted. You will also already find an agenda. Now, the idea is that in due course of this work, and we work towards adoption still this year. But the idea is that in due course, of course, there will be a general public consultation on the draft text for the implementing act. I think this will interest everybody. But also before that, we anticipate a targeted consultation, and notably through the means of the stakeholder network. And I understand all 3 of you are involved via EUCOPE, I think, and CPA is also a member. So that's also interesting for you to know. But of course, I need to stress a lot still needs to be hammered out, and there's a lot of things that interact. So when you talk about timeline and throughput times, for instance, we have some time points in the regulation, which I already mentioned, the D-Day, which is the 30 days after the adoption of the decision. Then there's also in the regulation 45 days at the latest for the industry, for the technology developer to submit a dossier before 45 days before the expected opinion of the CHMP of the EMA work being wrapped up. So there's a throughput time there. There's a sharp throughput time, and there's also some evolution in the proposal for the pharma review. So these things will interact. But what is certainly also clear is the actual shape of the implementing act, the steps, what is needed, is more needed, is less needed, what can be streamlined, where are efficiencies. It also, the content of what you intend to do and how to do it, it clearly also interacts with the time needed and the resources needed. So we're very well aware of this, and the member states as well, that there clearly is some kind of balance, a trade-off there. But I'll wrap it up. But yes, a lot of work to be done. legislative work, putting in place the details for the key components of the regulation, starting with the joint clinical assessment for medicinal products. And I would be terribly amiss if I failed to mention all the hard work that basically is also done in the back office, which is the IT platform, which really is key. How can we exchange information in a timely way that is secure, that respects confidentiality and all data protection considerations? And also there are a lot of work being done. Excellent job by the team. So I'll close here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. And it's a challenging exercise for sure, but I wanted to say also a big thank you for setting up the stakeholder network. I know there's a lot to do. It's really important that we have opportunities for interactions and that we keep that system as transparent as possible also in the setup and in the implementation phase. So thanks for all the work and the transparency in that respect. I would hand over to, or have a question for Anna, which is around the methodology. The EU HTA regulation acknowledges in a recital the special nature of evidence generation for certain therapies, such as ATMPs, orphan medicinal products, and also vaccines, where some data may not be readily available at time of launch, and it prescribes that the relevant methodologies must account for these specifics in those types of medicines, orphan drugs, ATMPs, and vaccines. So in practical terms, this means allowing the use of single-arm trials with real-world evidence as an external comparator arm. And the Commission proposal, meanwhile, will condition additional periods of incentives on providing data from comparative trials to EMA. So how will this impact access for patients, and especially for rare disease patients, from your perspective?
Yes, Alex. It is true that EU HTA regulation recognized the exceptional nature of evidence generation for orphan medicinal products and ATMPs and even vaccines. As it's already well known to all of us, so I'm not going to dig too much into that. In rare diseases, there are effectively practical but also ethical limitations which may prevent the gold standard RCT, randomized clinical trial approach. Often there are simply not enough patients available to conduct such trials due to the rarity of the disease, alongside with many other specificities. Now, interestingly enough, in the national HTA systems, an alternative approach of allowing single-arm trials, then having an historical comparator arm, is allowed. And we are indeed happy to see that this is also described in the UNETA 21 deliverable. However, while these approaches were described, in my view, they were not really endorsed on an equal line as the other approaches, which could then create a situation where even if a method is applied in a JCA, in a joint clinical assessment, then that this is not accepted when it comes to using the JCA in the national HTA procedures. And companies risk having to be asked to do additional analysis or additional studies, or even another scenario could be that the dossier could be considered incomplete, which would lead to the same delays because it would result in an interrupted JCA. So I think that to ensure that the EU HTA regulation also works for rare disease patients, again, arguably those with the highest unmet need, the described approaches for orphan medicinal products assessments and ATMPs must be endorsed on an equal basis as the other approaches by the HTA coordination group, or again, we risk that the HTA procedure would actually cause additional delays than what we observe today, something that we have already discussed today. When it comes to the GPL, the General Pharmaceutical Legislation, there is a proposal to condition incentives on providing data for comparative trials, on the other hand. So, in other words, this means that the use of single-arm trials with an external comparator arm, which was the example I was using before, as well as the use of real-world evidence, is discouraged. It is important, as Dirk already said, that the legislation that supports our pharmaceutical ecosystem is coherent, and that we cannot discourage certain approaches, which from a pragmatic point of view might be the only option available, while in other instances there is a recognition of the practical challenges. So I think what Dirk also mentioned, I completely echo that the upstream needs to be coherent then with the downstream. if these different legislations are not coherent, then the legislations will not achieve the intended objectives that all three of us have been outlining here already today. I just want to finish by giving one example. There is a proposal on developing the European health data space, which will allow for increased generation and use of real-world evidence, so real-world data and hopefully real-world evidence. Again, if we discourage the use of real-world evidence in the regulatory submission, then we are not making full use of the systems that we are building also in parallel, which could help fill the evidence gaps, particularly for rare diseases and then orphan medicinal products.
Thanks, Anna. While we are all aware also in industry that RCTs are the gold standard, but we also have to bear in mind that what we have seen over the last 15 years at the national level in HTA decision making, it have been those countries which have been able to also bring in some flexibility by using real-world evidence to complement real-world evidence, not by replacing randomized clinical trials necessarily, but using real-world evidence to close some data gaps which are clearly identified, and really that is really a very important approach which we also need to bring into the discussion at the EU HTA level. The door is open there because we have that recital that there is the possibility to take into account the specifics for rare disease medicines, orphan drugs, and ATMPs. So I think that's really critical because ultimately this also leads to a better access for patients if we allow for some flexibility in some situations which need to be justified why that flexibility is needed in individual cases. So we are not asking for replacing RCTs by real-world evidence, to be very clear about this year. And this is also what you made very clear in your statement. Thanks for this. Over to you, Antonella, from the patient perspective. I wanted to go back a bit to the what you call like time to access is key here, to that objective, which is totally shared, I think, among our stakeholders. Among the shared objectives of the EU HTA and the EU Pharmaceutical Package, improving patients' access to innovative therapy is in the coming decade is really the key objective, as we have all been agreeing before. So in your view, what are the best practices to really reach that important objective?
Thanks for this question. I can say that I share many of the concerns that Anna already mentioned. So in terms of best practices, what the first intention is that the joint clinical assessment should really be fast and should ideally be systematically implemented, adopted by all the member states. To this extent, I do understand that a top-down approach is not possible from the European Union level to the member states, but I think that some sort of incentives or actions must be put in place for the HTA bodies in the member states to adopt and not duplicate the work, because otherwise we see a true risk in not accelerating but doing the opposite. And so I think that this is the first thing that should be considered in terms of best practice in the HTA regulation. And I hope that the implementing act, the first one, is addressing some of these aspects on how member states can be, if not forced, can be incentivized, or can how the JCA is supposed to facilitate their work at member states level rather than adding more work. And then also in terms of the joint scientific consultation, that is also something that should help should be better coordinated and aligned to provide early advice to the industry. So this should help improving efficiency when it comes to the reimbursement process. And the third point that I would like to mention is the transparency and inclusiveness of the process as patients and other stakeholders should be involved. So we welcome this the effort of the European Commission setting up the stakeholders network, which is a very important tool, we believe. We're looking forward now to see the plan, because, for instance, what Dirk, you mentioned before, that the stakeholders network will be engaged into the consultation of the implementing acts before they are open for public consultation. But this was not clear in the first meeting. So I'm really looking forward to see what the role of this stakeholders network group will be in terms of consultations, in terms of opinions that we will be working on altogether. It would also be interesting to understand how the consultation or how the opinions of this stakeholder group will be taken into consideration in the implementing acts in the end.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Much appreciated. I would like to open the floor for questions now at this stage, and I can already see that we have 2 questions. Let me ask the first question, which is about the implementing acts, and it fits quite nicely to what you just alluded to, Antonella. The first question is probably directed to Dirk. Will the implementing acts be available for review on the by the European Commission or on the European Commission Have Your Say website for the broader public? And if yes, how will these reviews be acknowledged? If you could elaborate a little bit on how the consultation around the implementing acts will take place, Dirk, that would be much appreciated.
I can be short, yes. And then there was also, but then how? Yes, the draft text will be open for a general consultation. That is the usual 4-week period. How will views be recognized ordinarily? And there should be no exception. The individual contributions are shown, and there's also kind of a synthesis report where we take the main cues and lessons from the totality of contributions. So that is the answer to that question, Alexander.
Thanks so much. And we will certainly share that. The colleagues, Matthias Olsen, who is in charge in EUCOPE, will certainly watch this very closely and share it with all our members. So we get good feedback also from the EUCOPE perspective from our members. The second question is more about the national decision-making. So probably a bit harder to answer, but let's try. I understand the question is as follows. I understand that the joint health technology assessment does not result in an absolute price or absolute reimbursement, which is certainly true. What formula or formulas in plural can be used on a national level to translate the outcome of the joint health technology assessment into national prices according to a local currency and percentage of reimbursement? So what is that interaction between the joint HTA, the report, which is the outcome of that procedure, and the national pricing and reimbursement? I don't think there's any formula, right? There is any interference into national decision-making. Maybe if I may start with you again, Dirk, and then I would also ask around to Antonella and Anna what they think about that. How do we translate that into national prices?
What you said is absolutely correct. At the EU level, we stop at the effectiveness, indirect effectiveness, and we have no business with the actual cost inputs at national level. And of course, it can be, I do recognize that this can be very different depending on the national context. There could be huge differences in the salaries of health staff, which, for instance, go in your comparator. You could have different cost perspectives, which is limited to the direct money paid by the health system or the entire societal effect. So that is absolutely true. But at our level, we basically stop at providing an input when it comes to the effectiveness. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Any thoughts about this, Anna and Antonella? It's probably not an easy one because it depends on the national decision-making processes, right? So it can be 27-fold how you translate that into national prices. But Anna, you wanna give it a try to answer that?
Yeah, maybe I want to give a try. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, so this should be heard as my own expectations of how this could work out. My understanding is that the Joint Clinical Assessment report, as the name suggests, will report on the clinical assessment, and the outcome of it will, if I may say, merely describe the degree of the evidence that has been submitted. It will probably highlight the limitations of the data, but also the strength of the data from a pure, methodological point of view. But it will not distill a judgment whatsoever about the value of the technology itself. So I think the element of judgment is then what each national system will have to make up on their own. What the Joint Clinical Assessment should avoid is that then each system has to go through all the data, analyze in view of the state-of-the-art methodologies, and issue a report. That's what they will not have to do. So if that work is delivered to the national authorities, then they will say, okay, this is the report and this is how I judge this data. And that judgment is then what will directly impact their willingness to pay and consequently the price. This is what I expect, at least.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that bit outlook into the future, Anna. Antonella, anything to add from your end about national decision-making, translation into national procedures?
Sorry. So very briefly, my comment on this is that in the ideal world, we would like that some more inputs were given from the European level, so from the JCA, but that is still very limited. And so, unfortunately, this is what we see, a limitation of the current legislation.
Thanks, Antonella. The colleagues online, please feel free to ask additional questions. I have actually one very interesting question here, which is around single-arm trials compared to real-world evidence. And the question is as follows: single-arm trials compared to real-world evidence could be classified in the Joint Clinical Assessment as a very low degree of certainty of the relative effects, taking into account the strengths and limitations of the available elements according to grade. The member states could be then decide whether this very low evidence could be used to decide on a reimbursement decision and or considered for the added benefit. I guess there is a different I guess there are different bars for a reimbursement decision, yes, no, and the amount of benefit to decide on the price. Can you comment? So what, in a nutshell, what is the national discretion to use real-world evidence data? Let's assume we would accept it in the EU context. So what is the discretion at the national level? How can we translate that into a price? So I would think that, again, this is quite a bit in national discretion. But I don't know, Dirk, if you want to give it a try on this one. Again, a bit the future, but as we can see, people are very much interested in what will be in all those methodologies and how real-world evidence can be factored in. So Dirk, you want to give it a try on this one?
Yeah, I will start, of course, by recognizing that this is mostly subsidiarity. So in the member state realm, on the actual translation of the grading of the evidence and the confidence intervals, how narrow or wide they may be, into what does it mean in terms of what do I accept as a price point for reimbursement. So this clearly, and there are flanking complementary initiatives with the European Commission, with the pricing and reimbursement community. There are more how should I say, support to exchange of best practices, and this is certainly all going on with the Commission. But I do situate it rather in that area. So next thing I would say is, as I had already stressed, the nuts and bolts and the implementing act, we're really starting to discuss with member states next week. So some of the issues here may be answered, can't guarantee all of them. And then, yes, if you have it, as I said, we focus at the clinical effects, indirect effects. There is no aim as such to come up with to do some arbitrage and to start selecting or highlighting. But depending on the outcome of the discussion, it could indeed be that you have a description like grade tables, etc. And then indeed, I think many of the national jurisdictions have quite detailed pharmacoeconomic guidelines that also go into how this is then translated into information for pricing and reimbursement authorities. So I hope I kind of managed. I had to dance a bit around the question, Alexander. It's partly because the subsidiarity, also because a lot of the work is still to be done with the member states, in all honesty. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. So, but I think your answer was very clear at the end of the day, if I understand it correctly. You're saying that the member states could factor in real-world evidence, even to the extent they deem it appropriate for assessing that medicine. If they want to complement some on the cost effectiveness of a medicine, they can use whatever data they deem appropriate, right? So at the end of the day, it is not only the JCA to decide what level of data is or what type of data can be used in the system.
As you say, Alexander, I mean, and as some of the other speakers also said, two elements, the actual implementing acts still need to be hammered out. So will it be, to be answered? We have some inputs from UNETA. Those are good inputs, but there are inputs to a process that still need to materialize. That is one, and two, obviously we don't want duplication either. So it's always a bit between those two, and then you have subsidiarity. So and where we end, we will see. Hopefully we end at the sweet spot. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. Any comments from the other colleagues? Otherwise, I have another, probably last question before I would get back to my closing question to all of you. But Anna, Antonella, any questions on the real-world evidence? I think it's more a technical thing where we can factor that in. I think Dirk has alluded to that.
Exactly what Dirk said. Indeed, I mean, the grade methodology, again, as the name suggests, grades different types of evidence, and that is a simple outcome. How that outcome is then more or less permeable within the different HTA systems is what then ultimately will condition the price and the reimbursement decision.
Right.
And every HTA system does that today.
Right. Good. I'm looking at time, and I have two questions left here, and I would include them in my closing question, and I would ask you to give a brief answer, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes. One question is about how do you see the patient involvement? And I understand that patient involvement is foreseen in the EU HTA process, but if you could allude a little bit to this. And the second question is more a regulatory question. The continuum of evidence and scientific knowledge does not stop at the first registration. How do we, considering long-term evidence generation? It's a very good and a very important question, I think. So how do we, that's a very important one, I think. How do we, I mean, HTA does not stop at a certain point in time. I mean, evidence is evolving, and what the evidence base is in 3, 4, 5 years time from now is probably very different from today. So how is that factored in, and what's the role of the patient involvement? That I would make that my closing question. If you could all try to answer that. I know it's not easy in 1 or 2 minutes. That would be great. Starting this time maybe with Antonella, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Well, I on the technical side, I cannot answer, but what I can say is that on the patient involvement, we believe that so now patients in the regulations are mentioned as important stakeholders, but again, as each HTA body then can implement its own process, from the European level, there cannot be any imposition. But we are working now to make sure that the patient voice is systematically included into the process. and not just as an opinion that could be ignored at the end of the day, but we are working to make sure that the patients are involved in the process at the same level as all the other stakeholders, so with decision-making power, so voting power to the patients.
Great, thanks. I think it's really important that we include the patient's voice in these procedures. Who wants to go next? Is it Dirk? Do you want to go next on that patient involvement perspective and also the evolving evidence? How can we reassess under that procedure? Can we come back in 3, 4, 5 years time? Maybe you elaborate a little bit on this one.
Yes, quickly. So indeed, patient involvement. On the one hand, we have the stakeholder network, which is a more formalized forum at an aggregate level. And then, but this is within the details, of course, of how the implementing acts are hammered out. There's the possibility to involve experts, as you see in the main text of the regulation. So, and then what I would also add to this is the EU level does not negate the possibility for national level involvement of patients, of course, as I also saw suggested in the chat. So this to that point, when it comes to the evolving scientific knowledge, yes, there is. It is explicitly foreseen that there shall be GCA updates to the extent necessary, and basically new data and evidence being the main driver. So that is in the regulation. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. Anna, some final thoughts from your end before I wrap it up very quickly.
Yes, so maybe just on the patient's involvement, I can only say that I have been in instances where the patients were in the room, and this was extremely helpful, particularly in the case of rare diseases, where so little is often known by the decision makers, the people that have to make the decisions. They don't have enough information. And so I can only witness how helpful that was, and therefore I completely echo what Antonella and also Dirk said about patients' involvement. If I may, just 5 seconds about, final words. I just need to keep encouraging everyone to, now that we are all focusing on many of the details of the technicalities, which are of course crucial, it's still very healthy every now and then to zoom out, to remind ourselves of the original intent with which we have started to work on the new regulation, but also in reopening the GPL, and to validate if we are still on the right track. I think this is absolutely crucial now that we have these few very crucial months ahead. Thank you again for the invitation, Alex.
Thanks, Anna. Much appreciated. So let me very quickly wrap it up. We've heard from Dirk that the implementing acts are on the way and soon to be released and consulted on, which is very good. Thanks for the transparency around this, and we will be really looking into this in all detail. We've heard from Anna, I think, that we need enough slots for scientific advice, and we need the right methodology for specific medicines such as orphan drugs, HMPs, and also vaccines, because that's already foreseen in the regulation. And I think we've heard some very good examples why that is needed, not replacing RCTs per se, because we all recognize that this is a gold standard, but we need to have some flexibility here and there. We've also heard from Antonella that at the end of the day, it's all about time to access from the patient perspective. It's key. We're starting with oncology medicines, and those patients need those products as soon as possible. And I think we can also summarize that this is not only about the EU HTA doing the job in terms of speedy patient access. We've heard that the early to be released report is very positive. It will probably speed up national procedures. We've also heard that industry might play a role in that respect in the pharma package by only giving the full amount of incentives when the product is launched or filed in the respective member states. But I think we should also not forget about the existing legislation. We definitely should look at the Transparency Directive, in my point of view, because there are clear timelines for national decision making. And what's the value of having a product launched in all countries if it's not authorized and reimbursed, and if timelines are just lapsed and are just running for much longer than the foreseen timelines in the EU Transparency Directive? So we really have to look into better application of the existing legislation. That should be part of the puzzle, and I think that should be an important piece of the puzzle which we are really, which we need to do, which we need to finalize when we want to come to a better patient access in the near future. I would like to thank all of you, the panelists, Anna, Antonella, and last but not least, Dirk. It's a great pleasure to have all three of you here with us today. I would like to thank the audience, especially the people asking those brilliant questions. And last but not least, I would like to thank all the colleagues in the EUCOPE office for setting up this webinar. Stefania, Stefano, Matthias, and Dante, last but not least, who are in the room in Brussels. And I'm very grateful that you've been setting this up. Thanks to all of you. Have a good Thursday, and see you soon in our 4th episode of the Life Science Lectures. Thanks so much.